Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we did have a number of matchups over the course of these last several days since the last time we recorded, including a pair of games by Oklahoma City, right? That, kind of showcased what type of team they can be depending on the night. Obviously, in the first game, it was the last time we talked, we had the first matchup between OKC and Denver. And OKC took that matchup in the first one, right? It was a close game for about 3 quarters. Then you had the blowout in the fourth quarter. Then Denver comes back, has a much better performance this time around against OKC. They blow him back out. Jalen Williams gets hurt in the process, right? This was a game where OKC, it was kind of like the other one. OKC was up for most of the game, but then in the fourth quarter, Denver took over. They dropped 140 points on OKC. So that series ended up being a split this season, right? With OKC taking the first one, then the first one at the beginning of the season, then Denver took the second one, then OKC and Denver take the split again. So, kind of a good showcase between two really good teams, two teams that are generally considered to be the two best teams in the Western Conference, right? But then OKC goes into Boston, right? The previous night you're watching this on Friday, but on Wednesday they go into Boston and they beat them 118 to 112, right? Taking that season series in a sweep, right? And this one again, no J-Dub for OKC, but no Porzingis for Boston, who's just continued to be out with an illness, unfortunately, for the last several games. I don't think he's played since February.
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's been a tough stretch for him, I guess, health wise, right? Because he's played in barely over 30 games this season. So not a lot of games, but again, that's kind of in some ways expected, just given his injury history. Although this one is different because this is health related. But either way, with OKC, again, this you can see why in over the course of this game why OKC is a dangerous team and why they're continued to be the one seed and continuing to be way ahead of everyone else in the Western Conference, right? They did it with their defense in that first quarter, right? Boston got up 24 shots, nearly every single one was a three, right? I think it was 22 threes and then two 2-point attempts, right? So pretty wild game from that perspective, and OKC controlled it for most of the game. Boston eventually tied it up in the fourth quarter, and then OKC was able to pull it out, right? They started the fourth, right, with that double big lineup, right, that we've been seeing more and more as they've gotten healthier with Chet Holmgren and Hartenstein, and you can see the value that Chet brings, right, to this team, as well as Hartenstein, right, what both of those guys can do with their size, with their high IQ, with Chet Holmgren being able to move around defensively, be mobile, and switch out, being able to block shots, although he only had one block in this game, but we know he can also deter other shots. Doesn't have to be a block. 15 rebounds, 3 of 6 from 3, right? Which you needed that, right? With J-Dub out, you needed somebody else to kind of be able to make up for his absence, right? And then SGA, another great game with 34 and 7, with 1 steal and 5 rebounds, 11 of 20 from the field, right? Continuing to make his MVP case, right? Because of the fact that we've just seen pretty much, against all the top teams, right? SGA has had statement games pretty much against all of them, right? Again, he's averaging over 30 a game. We've talked about his stats before. And with the way that OKC has played this season with him as the leader of their team, right? Back-to-back seeds, but this time they're way ahead of the pack compared to last year. And unlike last year, they've also had more injuries this year, right? They haven't had a ton of games with their full lineup because we haven't seen as many games with the double big. And we didn't really get to see them against some of the best teams because a lot of those times they were hurt, right? We got to see it a couple of times, but, now, again, this is kind of one of the reasons why we have him as the MVP because you got the combination of the numbers and the impact and the winning, right? Like, obviously, with Jokic, it's tough because he's had a great season. Certainly, he can win the MVP as well. If he wins it, I'm not going to be disappointed or anything. But, it's just tough, right? Because we talked about, like, in the NBA now, you just have a lot more guys that are capable of putting up these crazy numbers. But in this case, this is going to be a scenario where you got basically the best record in the West, second best record in the NBA, with a guy putting up great numbers. And, it's just for Boston, it's tough because they didn't really have anybody who could guard him. I mean, when you look over at Boston side, Jaylen Brown had an awful game. He has not played well at all in either of the OKC games. They've been able to limit him and kind of force him into, I don't know, kind of like these possessions where he feels like he's trying to do a little bit too much, a little bit ball stoppishness,
Mhm.
right? And it's kind of hard to do that against this OKC team with the way that they can fly around and swarm around and get steals and deflections. It's tough. Tatum, for his part, he did his thing. He was really good in this game, right? He was 4 of 13 from three, but outside of that, no complaints. White was good, just obviously fouls. That was a problem. Both him and Jaylen Brown fouled out. And, they just don't really have anybody that can really stick with him. And it's tough because it's not like they're not trying to guard him. It just didn't matter, right? And he got to the free throw line 11 times, 10 of 11 from the free throw line, but he still shot over 50% from the field, right? The only real blemish was the threes. But, I mean, pretty much from him, I mean, he played a great game, and he played in both matchups against the Celtics. He torched them. And that's going to be the interesting part. If these two teams potentially meet, you do have a scenario where SGA could be the best player out there, given that it just doesn't seem like the Celtics can really slow him down at all. And if it's like a low scoring game where it's a lot of defense going on and Boston just can't hit their threes, only 30%, 63 3-point attempts. OKC is going to win games like that. So it just kind of goes to show the special season that OKC is having.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that's the big takeaway is I think this needs to be centered around, Shea and what, the Thunder have been doing because honestly, there's a lot of doubters, a lot of haters. The narrative has completely switched up on SGA and it really came out of nowhere, to be honest. But, as a team and as a unit, I think what they're able to do is special. They're constructed a certain type of way. You can tell they're very versatile in the things that they do, but it starts at the top with Shea. Like you said, like you really look at this game and you have to dissect it, right? Look who's really trying to guard Shea in these situations. It's Drew Holiday, Derek White. Those guys are not chumps on defense. They're top tier defenders, and Shea is getting them off balance, and that's the key, And that's what makes him so scary is he can get anybody off balance, and that's pretty much a guaranteed 20 to 30 plus points a night. And I think that's the danger is, who do they have that can really limit what he can do on the offensive end and defensively as well. I liked what I saw from him as well, using his length, kind of getting after guys at times. But, what is the ceiling for this Oklahoma City team? I think is everybody's question. There are doubters, there are a lot of haters, but like I said, they continue to be versatile and they can pretty much throw anything at you, really. That like you talked about the double big lineup, that thing is OP. Having Chet, having Hartenstein, being able to bang down low, it's awesome. They get after O boards. The rebounding is something they've definitely improved in. So, overall, I really have enjoyed watching them throughout this season. And this game is exactly why, because you kind of got the best of everything without J-Dub. And that's super key because, if Chet can step up like this in the playoffs, that's going to be huge. Alongside a guy like J-Dub in the second unit, commanding those stretches where, SGA isn't on the floor, it's going to be amazing. It might be a cakewalk for them. And I think they're probably going to surprise a couple, teams maybe in like the first two rounds where it's like, this is going to be way harder than we thought. Because I think the exponential growth that we've seen, from this team, not even just from the last couple of years, but really just from this singular season has been really spectacular. Because like I said, it starts from the top because what Shea has been doing has been ridiculous in terms of the advanced analytics. I'm not going to delve into that too much, but yeah, just know the net rating is crazy.
Yeah, and it's kind of a longer conversation where there feels kind of like, despite the fact that you got two teams, right, that record wise in the East and the West are, stats wise and record wise and ratings wise
Mm-hmm.
seem like the two best teams in the league.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really see a lot of people, well, I guess the difference is OKC is like, I guess, the Vegas favorite in the West, but I feel like there's a lot of people now that don't buy OKC as much coming out of the West, right?
Yeah.
Like, obviously you can take your pick at whatever other teams people pick. There's a handful of them, right? You got Denver, you got Golden State, you got LA. And then in the East, right? Same with the Cavs, right? Like a lot of people are still, going back to Boston. I mean, that was still my pick to come out of the East and win the title. But like, you do have to take these teams seriously. But I guess the question is, why is it that, people just don't really buy into the likelihood that those teams could come out of their respective conferences and win the title. Because it's got to be some combination of maybe for OKC the age, right, the lack of playoff experience. For the Cavs, I guess could it be that? Maybe I think also it might be the second options too, right? Do their second options profile as your typical second options for championship teams? But what do you think it is, right? Because I think you could also make the case that because we haven't seen these teams be this dominant, it's just people just not being used to what we're seeing and maybe just kind of going with what you're more familiar with. But what do you think?
I think I'll speak on OKC first, and then I'll speak on Cleveland. I think it goes to the previous showings of these teams. Like, they didn't
Yeah.
really break up the core with either of these teams. But starting with Oklahoma City, like the core is relatively the same. We're kind of just looking at exponential growth, which is why I'm confused as to why people aren't high on this team, because people were pretty high on them last year.
Hmm.
Not to make the finals or anything, but they thought that they would, at least do a little bit better than what they did
We
last
picked
year.
them to beat Dallas.
Exactly, us included. So, the core hasn't changed. They added in, a couple of free agents, and they were able to also get, Caruso and stuff like that. So, I don't know. I think it really comes from just the poor showings from last year, where there were visible flaws in both teams. Game plan, identity, the supporting cast as well. Because with Oklahoma City, it was pretty much just Shea, Shea all 4 quarters, and
Right.
we didn't really get an emergence of J Dub or Chet Holmgren, and it just didn't look like they were going to be the regular season dominance didn't really translate to the playoffs. And I think that's probably what people are kind of scared of with Oklahoma City. And with Cleveland, I think it's kind of the same thing, but the exponential growth has come from their guys as well internally, but also you got a coaching switch up. The offense looks amazing. It just doesn't look like as stagnant as last year, and I think that's the beauty in that, is they've really found a system to make it work. Because once again, we talked about Cleveland in the offseason, and we were pretty much convinced that those 4 guys could not coexist, with their designated partners pretty much. And it just, we left leaving that series like, with a bad taste in our mouth. But obviously they rallied and switched things up. But I don't really know what the negative connotation would be with them. I'm sure it's more so, well, we've seen Boston do it and we've seen them go to the finals and then win it. We haven't really seen much of Cleveland. That's what I would probably say, where people are kind of skeptical about them. Which I think is fair. Like, and there's nothing wrong with being, skeptical on both the number 1 seeds, because,
Right.
they are young, they have young pieces, and they don't have, the full experience of, say, getting to the Western Conference Finals or the finals. So I think, that's the key with those, and the Eastern Conference Finals as well for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Like, I believe Donovan Mitchell's been, but outside of that, who can you really say has a whole lot of, playoff experience to the point where, yeah, this is the ideal championship team. But I think the beauty of this is
Mhm.
this could be the years where they build and gain that experience. That's why I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
understand why we're not putting 2 and 2 together. It's pretty
Yeah.
obvious, I think.
Yeah. I don't think Mitchell's been to the conference
He
finals because
hasn't.
I think,
Hmm.
yeah, because I was going to say, because in Utah, I don't think they ever got past the second round.
Okay.
Um, I think the closest that they got was that year with against the Clippers where Kawhi got hurt. And then it didn't matter because then Terrence Mann had, the 40-point game or whatever
Oh
he
my
had.
god, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but either way, yeah, I think you hit on it just from the perspective of, yeah, it's because they're not as experienced, they haven't done it, and they're younger, right? And even people felt that way about Boston, right? How many times last season did we hear from a lot of people, including people who follow our channel, right? Like, how many times did we hear people, think that Boston was kind of like a fraudulent team,
Yeah.
right? That and it was because of all the previous times they went into the playoffs, still made deep runs, but just couldn't quite get over the hump, right? They got to the finals against Golden State. They couldn't pull it off. Then they went down 3-0 against the Heat, right? And then they tied it up and ended up losing in game 7. So it's kind of just a scenario where, like, those teams are just going to have to prove it. And I think they can. Like you said, this could be the year, right? Even the Nuggets, right? That was because I remember the year they won the title, we definitely didn't have them coming out of the West,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, I'm pretty sure two of the three. I'm pretty sure that we picked them to lose both to the Suns and both to LA, and they
Yes,
beat
we
both
did.
of them, right? Like
Yep.
so, and we weren't necessarily alone, right? Like there were a lot of people that were not sold on Denver's likelihood as a championship team, right? People asked, can you build a team around a guy in Jokic who's, not a great defensive big man, right? Can their supporting cast be good enough to be able to get him over the top? Considering how people feel about them when they're not, all-star guys usually, even though Murray's got a great playoff resume by and large. So, or even the Warriors, right? Like I think way back in 2015, their first title, I don't think anyone really picked them to win the title that year, right?
Hmm.
I mean, you can go back and you can think of the teams that were really good, right? You had Cleveland. I mean, obviously they had the injuries, so that would be a factor. I think the Spurs, because they were the defending champs, OKC before Durant hurt his foot, the Clippers, right? Like, I mean, sometimes things just kind of click and things just kind of happen. And I just think when they've been playing at the way they've been playing and the rate that they've been winning, I just have a hard time expecting them to just go out in the first two rounds. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're
Like,
going to be
well,
representing the Western Conference. I think
I
the
mean,
writing's on the wall.
right, yeah, and like definitely Cleveland, like they pretty much have a bye. I mean, at this point, right? Like, I mean, they're like, there's no way they're gonna lose to whoever is the eighth seed in the East. I mean, like, take your pick, right? Atlanta, Orlando, Miami, Chicago. I mean, they're not gonna lose to any of those teams unless there's a knock on wood horrific injury setting. Then in the second round, they'll play the Bucks or the Pacers, maybe the Pistons, depending on who finishes there, because those standings are pretty close. I mean, maybe it's a tougher matchup, but I mean, the Cavs have played all those teams pretty well. Then they get to the conference finals. So, I mean, could they lose to the Bucks or the Pacers? I guess, right? But I don't really excuse me, I don't really expect them to. But I guess the main thing with the Cavs is all the depth, right? What happens if some of those guys don't show up in the playoffs? But then I guess you could just play the starters more, right? Like because like Donovan Mitchell, most of those guys barely play over 30 minutes a game,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, like I'd imagine come playoff time, you could bump them up to 35 plus, and you'll probably be fine. And then you can just kind of pick and choose which guy you want to play depending on the series because they just have so much depth. Then from OKC's perspective, they have a decent amount of depth too. It's just some of the depth pieces are younger. But I don't know. Like I think that's kind of where it's at. Where I think they're in the same thing. They're in the same tier with Boston from last year, where I think they're gonna have to just prove it. And
Yeah.
then from Boston's perspective, they just haven't played as well as they did last season, and their record is still really good.
And that's
But
okay.
yeah, exactly. And that's fine, right? It's just something to think about, right? Because they have, I think, the worst split of those three teams, right? Because they split the series against the Cavs 2-2, and then they lost both OKC games, right? Cleveland won, or they split the Boston series, and then they split OKC.
Hmm.
And then OKC split against the Cavs and then swept the Celtics, right? So I think the Celtics, I mean, have the worst direct matchup of the three. But in fairness, with the regular season matchup, sometimes it's tough because guys don't always play or are available in all of them, right? Like I don't think the Celtics have had a game against the Cavs where all their guys are there, right? If I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we didn't really get to see that. Um, but you're right. Like I think for these teams, like there's a reason why these three teams are considered the best, right? It's just two of those are going to have to prove it, right? Because I think a lot of people are also defaulting to Boston, kind of myself included, because they've already proven it. And I don't think that they have to have home court in order to get through the postseason. But even for somebody like me, like, would I, at this point, based off of how the season's gone, would I be shocked if Boston lost to either of those teams? Not if they play the way they've been playing the regular season in
Sure.
terms of Cleveland and OKC. It's just a question of, yeah, like say it's 3-2 and I don't know, say take OKC, right? They're up 3-2 against whoever they play in the second round or the conference finals, right? And it's
Yeah.
like a 5-point game with 3 minutes to go. Is there a scenario where they lose? Like like you do have to at least consider it, right? I mean, you could say that about a lot of teams, but I think that's what some people are thinking, right? Like cuz a lot of people feel like come playoff time, some of the shots may not come as easily, right, for some of these guys, but the thing is that's why they've been doing it with their defense, right? Cuz you could also flip it and be like, Well, because you can say this about any team. What if they get hot?
Yeah.
And like let's say like some of these guys that are a little bit up and down shooting wise, what if they just stay consistent, right? But I think it also like the second options play a factor too, right? Just do people trust, like if you look at the different playoff teams and compare the second options, like, OKC's number one is SGA, right? That's about as good of a first option as you could have outside of like
Bonafide.
a Jokic, or, someone. Yeah, exactly. But then, and we've seen him in the playoffs where like he's fine. You know what I mean? Like I like I mean, obviously since he last year was the only year that he was in there as a superstar. But again, I don't feel like when I watched him in the playoffs last year, he didn't look like he was, out of sorts to me. Maybe in like that first game, but then after that, everything else was smooth sailing. So, but then I think that's what it is, right? Because like if you look at the other second options, right, with SGA and J Dub, then you go down the list in the standings, right? Memphis, right? It's Ja and Triple J, right? With Desmond Bain, I guess, as the third guy,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever you want to
Mm-hmm.
look at, right? Denver, Jokic and Murray, right? LA, Braun and Luca,
Mm-hmm.
or Houston, we don't know,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
We don't even know who's number one.
I guess before he got hurt, it was looking like Amen Thompson, but
Yeah,
he's.
for real. What a tear he was on.
And then obviously, so take them out of the equation, and then
Mm-hmm.
for Golden State, right? Steph and Jimmy, right? Like I think that's what I think what people are looking at is like for some of these teams, I think people like the other second options more. I think that's what it comes down to. Like say, like with Golden State, even though like they've been playing great, and I think some people look at a situation where we talked about it, right? Like there's a scenario where maybe SGA outplays Steph, but then Jimmy Butler outplays J Dub, and then that might offset it, and then that might be enough for them to pull off the upset in a way where you could always flip it and something else happens. I think that's what it ultimately comes down to. And then for Cleveland, their second option too. You look at all that. I guess what Garland or Mobley,
Yeah.
whomever. What do you
Probably
think about
Garland.
this?
I would probably say it's Garland. I mean
Mhm.
I like Cleveland's collective unit, and I like, there's their number one option obviously
Mhm.
and their second option as well, cuz I think, they're both good, and even like with Oklahoma City, like J-Dub is not a bad second option. I think this is going to be his coming out party, if you want me to be honest, in terms of the playoff, performer. I think he's really going to show out, especially within the first two rounds. And I think Chet will probably wake up, in the Western Conference Finals. I hope that would be sick to see. But like, and here's my thing, like with the
Mhm.
Celtics, like going back to them, I think, as bad as it is to say, I think the reason why I wasn't too high on them was because I wasn't sure, if Tatum and Brown would, kind of pick up where they left off in the playoffs. I think Tatum has,
Yeah.
but Brown,
Right.
I'm kind of like, well, I look at him as the X factor more than I do Porzingis, which I don't think is a good thing for them.
Right. Yeah.
Because I think if
Exactly.
if you're a superstar, if you're number two or 1A, 1B, whatever, is looked at as an X factor from my eyes, I just don't really feel like you're going to go back to back. It's not to say that you're a bad team or anything like that, but I think that's the question that does get raised. But with
Yeah.
Cleveland, I just like everything that they have going on for them. They can run isolation, they can run pick and roll, they can pretty much do whatever they want.
All
Um,
or big.
Exactly. Garland can kind of flip that switch where it's like, all right, I need to be a scorer. I'll be a scorer. But then he can facilitate, which I think is beautiful. Having a guy like Donovan Mitchell who can pretty much do the same thing, but definitely is a little bit more aggressive in terms of the scoring. Evan Mobley added to his bag. So, yeah, I think these teams are so talented. That's the crazy part. And same thing with Oklahoma City, but it's really going to be, some coming out parties for the young guys in terms of what they can really do in the playoffs, because we know that there's a ton of NBA players who are great in the regular season, but a lot that don't show up in the postseason. And I hope, that none of those teams have any of those kinds of guys on them. But it seems like Oklahoma City and Cleveland definitely have some guys that are kind of primed for a run like that.
Yeah, because that's what you got to be looking for if you're OKC. Because if J Dub and Chet can, like you said, break out, which
Yeah.
we have seen in different postseasons in the past, where
Yeah.
like these guys, have their coming out party and everything just clicks,
Yep.
and then boom, all of a sudden, before you know it, right? Like you said, you're in the conference finals when people didn't expect you. I mean, I think people would hope that they'd be in there given the record. I'm just saying that like you said, if those guys break out, that should be a finals team. Like that should be enough to be
Yeah.
able to to get there because, then the defense will kind of figure itself out and the offense will figure itself out. And we already know the defense is legit. So that's kind of really what we're looking for. But like you said, it's something to think about because that's really what it comes down to is I think a lot of people feel like they may be able to trust some of the guys on the other teams more. And that's what it comes down to, which again, like there's nothing wrong, like you said, with that thought process. It's just, and that's the tough part is that sometimes these things kind of just happen
Yeah.
when you least expect it. And, when it does, you're kind of shocked, right?
Yeah.
Because, we've seen it, right? How many times, like say Minnesota, right? Like we thought that maybe they could beat the Nuggets, but we still expected the Nuggets to win that series. And then what happens, right? It's game 7, Denver's up 20, and then they just
I'll
completely
never get
blow
over
it.
that.
Yeah, like
Even the round
Minnesota.
before that, though. Like,
Yeah,
we did not pick Minnesota. We picked freaking
yeah,
Phoenix. And it's
Yeah,
like, bro,
exactly.
what?
Yeah,
It came out of
and then
nowhere.
Minnesota. Yeah, and then Minnesota broke up that team. But regardless, like that's the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes when these breakouts happen, you know, when they happen really fast.
Yeah.
And it gets to a point where some of these guys might be ahead of schedule, and that's what we're hoping for if you're Oklahoma City,
Yeah.
right? So,
And I think
and we've
J-Dub,
already talked.
is probably the guy with the most eyes on him, number one, but he's also probably the most likely to as well, considering the situation and the way that they use him. Like when Shea isn't on the floor, it's J-Dub, J-Dub, J-Dub. So that's why I think, it's right there in front of us, but
Yeah,
could
and
be
he's gonna
wrong.
have to. Yeah, and he's gonna have to figure that out, right? Where if he does, and he's a legit number 2, right, then they'll be fine.
Yep.
So that's what we're hoping for. But we'll see. But again, there's I think there's still both of our picks to get out of the
Oh
Western
yeah, yeah.
Conference. Right?
Yeah, no
We
question.
felt that way going into the season,
Yep.
and we thought that they'd take a leap,
Yep.
and so far it looks like they have, and we haven't even seen too many games of them at full strength.
Yep.
I think that's the part where I'm excited about seeing them. When they have all their guys and they'll be able to go through the postseason,
Yep.
one game at a time.
Yes, sir.
Had another matchup, Denver, Minnesota, right? Minnesota trounced the Nuggets again,
Yeah.
right? I believe they pretty much dominated the season series. I think the first game, the first week or whatever of the season was close and the Nuggets kind of stole it at the end. But the last few times they played, it's just been a beatdown. No Aaron Gordon for Denver. And Minnesota now has gotten back to being healthy now, right? And when you look at the Wolves, right, now they're in this stretch where they're 7-3 in their last 10, and they've won 6 in a row, right? So all their wins in that 7-3 stretch have just come in, and now they're like basically right there with Golden State, where they think they have one more win. Golden State has one less loss, right? So a bad loss by either of these teams could flip them, in one of these spots. But with Minnesota, they look a lot better now, right? Where now I think part of it is that you're just getting better performances from some of these guys like DiVincenzo, who was bad early in the season. He's been better. Obviously, he also had an injury that kept him out for a while. They were able to stay afloat with some of these guys like Terrence Shannon Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
right, and a couple other guys getting some minutes. Now they don't really play because now their full rotation's there.
Mm-hmm.
But Jaden McDaniels, right, who was rough on offense early in the season, he's been a lot better, right? Randall's been playing well since he's come back from his injury because he was out for a long time with a groin injury. Gobert's back. And then Mike Conley too, right? Because he was, pretty bad to begin the season, where it looked like it might be ready for him to, kind of start getting ready for retirement.
Yeah.
But now he's been much better as of late. Where now they look a lot better, right? I still wouldn't necessarily feel confident about their ability to win
Nope.
a playoff series,
Nope.
but they look a lot better now. And at the very least, I'd be a little nervous if I was Denver and I ended up as the 2 seed and Minnesota was 7, right? I'd be a
Agreed.
little bit nervous just given the fact. And again, regular season versus playoffs can be different, but just the way that they're able to be physical with them, force them into a ton of threes and they can't hit them. And then Minnesota offensively has, flipped the script and it looks like it's pretty easy for them to score against the Denver defense, and they're able to slow them down. And it's not even close anymore, where it's just, now it's just kind of a brutal matchup, it feels like at this point, right? Where it's just, they're able to kind of slow down the water of Murray and Michael Porter Jr., and it's tough for Denver. And, again, I'm not saying that they're going to lose to Minnesota in the first round. I'm just saying I'd be a little bit nervous about that matchup. And it's funny because I thought going into the season that it'd be better for Denver, right? Because
Yeah.
because without Towns you're a little bit smaller, but it hasn't mattered. It just hasn't, and they've been able to just they've been rattling off wins, and they have an easy schedule, much like Golden State too. So there's a pathway for them to be able to close the season out strong and maybe get to 6. Might be a little bit of a stretch. I mean, it's very close between them and Golden State, but it still would be a disappointing season. But at least it seems like they found something with the way they've been playing lately. Even like a Jalen Clark, who I think now is part of the regular roster, he gets minutes here and there too.
Yeah, I mean, I loved everything that I saw from the Timberwolves in this game, and I think it starts on the defensive end. They make Jamal Murray one of the most 50-50 streaky players anytime that they go up against him. He's either going to have like 20 something or he's going to literally crap the bed. And lo and behold, yeah, he did not play very well at all. 4 for 15.
Right.
So, I think their ability to make, the obvious number 2 guy on Denver very uncomfortable is a great thing. That's kind of their advantage and their edge, because we all know when Jokic goes off for a monster game, or something like that, probably means that they're gonna lose because they're not getting that much elsewhere. But I think a fair point is that Aaron Gordon didn't play in this game, and he is a
Right.
crucial part of their offense and defense. But
They're an average team without him.
exactly. And that's the tough part. You need to stay healthy. What does Jamal Murray look like in the playoffs? But back to Minnesota, I think everything's really clicking from their perspective. They're hitting all their shots. Julius Randle looks pretty solid. We'll see how that looks come playoff time. Anthony
Right.
Edwards continues the great run that he's on, and we already know that he's a playoff riser. So I think anybody who really is scared, or anybody who's going to play Minnesota, should be scared because of that factor. Having a guy like Anthony Edwards and having to deal with him for a 7-game series, I think is no joke. So I'm curious, what the final standings are going to look like. Then we can really talk about, some serious matchups. But yeah, things are starting to click for them. Nas Reed solid, like you said. McDaniel's showing signs of life on offense when he was looking completely just not there at all. Conley, like you said. So, I think this is more of the version that I think we expected Minnesota to really look like. When they did trade away Cat, because of the CBA thing or whatever. But still, clear regression. I don't think people are super high on them as a unit. I think people still
Right.
love Ant and are still high on his future. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how I feel about this team, going into the playoffs. But Denver, I think, will be fine. I just need to see them healthy again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, with the Wolves, like you said, we'll see where they're at. But yeah, this is closer to what we were hoping to see earlier in the
Mm-hmm.
season that we didn't get. And I think, again, it probably was also just going to take time to figure some stuff
Yep.
out, right? Like I think when you see Chris Finch, I think he's kind of figured out like, the right minutes and kind of the right combinations of guys to use,
Yep.
which again, that can be a little bit of a challenge when again you had a team like you said that was pretty much unchanged, and then all of a sudden you have a pretty significant change in it, and now you gotta have to go back to square one again. So it's good to see them bouncing back, but they have played well against OKC too. Like I
Mm-hmm.
believe they split that series, so they've had some pretty good performances against you know, some of the best teams in the Western Conference. It's just a matter of, like you said, what do the final standings look like? Because again, for them, I think again, for any of these teams in the play-in, you don't want to be in the play-in.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how realistic is it to get out of it. Like Sacramento and Dallas are probably stuck in there, just because I don't think they're going to be able to win at the rate that they would need to in order to catch up to, Golden State or Houston. I mean, maybe the Clippers, but Norman Powell's been out. Kawhi can't play in back to backs. They've been they've been pretty average as of late.
Yeah.
So the Wolves may have the best shot at being able to climb out of there, but they're going to need some help because again, Golden State had the tiebreaker, right? Because Golden State was able to win that season series, and that was all before the Butler trade. And couple of those games were really close where, if you're Minnesota, you're kind of, kicking yourself in the head because if you had won one of those games, you'd have the tiebreaker and you'd probably be, right ahead of Golden State. But, that's kind of how the games go over the course of the season.
Yeah.
So,
The ebb and flow of the standings.
yeah. Then you look at the Memphis Grizzlies, they're 5-5 in the last 10, but they have won 4 in a row, right? And since Jaren Jackson Jr. has gone down, and I think the thing that's at least encouraging now is that when you watch Ja play, he looks a lot closer to being more like himself. Obviously, they've had a couple of really close calls recently, right, against, some bad teams. Obviously, again, they're missing their, the guy that was their best player pretty much for most of the season. But Ja pretty much in the last several games has been really good. The 3-point shooting has been better. He's made some big plays for them as well. And that's kind of what all you can really ask for, right? You look at the last 4 games that they've won, 31 and 8, 32 and 6, 29 and 12, 28 and 7, right? And then, from 3, right, it's been kind of up and down, but, at least not like the disaster that it was earlier in the season. And again, that's key for him, right? And he's getting to the line more too, right? And that's the thing that we talked about, where that's what's going to keep Memphis afloat while Jaren Jackson Jr. is out, is if you now get a much better version of Ja Morant, where if you can get the version that we had seen prior to this season, right, then you can stay afloat without Jaren Jackson Jr. and pick up a lot of wins, because they don't have the toughest schedule remaining, right? Because it's, again, some of these teams that I mentioned aren't the best teams, but either way, we didn't necessarily know what to expect because he had been kind of an under discussed disappointment for much of this
Hmm.
season, right? Like, he just hadn't really been quite himself. But if we're gonna get this version of Ja and he's here to stay, then that makes me feel a lot better about Memphis, and it definitely makes me feel better about their ability to stay afloat, because they had dropped to 4, about a week ago, right? And now since then they've moved up to 2, right? Because the Lakers have lost a few games now because their injuries are starting to catch up to them. And then Denver's been 500 the last, 10 games, just like Memphis as well. But Memphis has won most of their recent games. Denver won most of their earlier games. So, that's a good sign, I think, for Memphis. Because, again, like, regardless of whether or not it's the regular season or the playoffs, they need this Ja Morant. If you can get that version of Ja, plus what we saw from Jaren Jackson Jr. before he got hurt, and then Desmond Bane, where he's been a lot better, right, since the early part of the season with the oblique injury, I think, right? Then, I still wouldn't pick them to win the West, but they would be a much more, dangerous team than they would be if you got the version of Ja who just, again, just wasn't himself. So that's a good, encouraging sign for the Grizzlies. And again, prior to that, it was 4 bad, close losses, right? Now it's a handful of, close wins, right? So again, you flip some of those and the record could have been even better. But the big thing is Ja needs to be healthy, and it seems like he's getting closer to being fully healthy.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the amazing part is you need him healthy, come playoff time. And we already know what he looks like in the playoffs. It's actually really scary. Like in 2021, it was 30 points, and just dismantling everything.
Yeah,
2022, kind of similar. In 2023, I think it was the one where he was shooting lights out from the 3-point line. So,
yeah, against the Lakers.
exactly. So, we already know that he doesn't really tend to drop off or fall off in the playoffs. So we kind of are expecting him to get exponentially better in that regard. But like you said, the regular season numbers were looking kind of fraudulent. But,
Mhm.
if he's going to end up going into the playoffs like this, then I think we're in trouble, because those numbers are kind of closer to, like 2021, 2022, and I think that's really scary, if you're going to be facing a team like Memphis, because we already know what they could do defensively. They're deep. They have a bunch of guys on their team that can do, stuff with or without the ball. And then obviously Triple J, when he comes back, that defense is going to skyrocket once again. So, I think they're a scary team. Definitely one that could be prone to make some noise.
Exactly, yeah, because that and again, all you can ask for is, can you survive without Jaren Jackson Jr.? And
Yeah.
you should be able to with Ja and Desmond Bane if you can get Ja to play, like we know he can, and that's what you've gotten from them as of late, and that's what you want, right? That's what you need, because at the point of the season where you need to win more games to stay afloat, right? Your superstar guy, right? Your franchise guy is coming through for you, so that's all you can ask for at this point. So hopefully he's able to keep it up, right?
Yeah.
Because again, we want him to be healthy for the long run. So
Yeah.
right, and then the Knicks, right? They were able to get a couple of wins against a couple of teams, right? You got the win over the Kings, right, and then you got the win over the Blazers, right? And the thing for them as of late, right, is it does seem like their defense has been better as of late. It seems like since Mitchell Robinson has come back, they've been one of the better defensive teams in the league. Again, we know it's going to be tough because he's their best player. He's the guy that kind of controls and runs all of their offense. But, in the last couple of games, this is kind of the argument for why you make a trade like the one for Bridges, right? Where no Brunson, right? But he's able to step in and give you the offense that you need while he's out, right? 33 points, 2 of 4 from 3, the game winner. Towns with 21 and 7, right after kind of a stretch of games where he didn't look really that great. OG, right, playing well, right? Josh Hart still doing his thing, not shooting well, but it doesn't really matter. But just in general, again, we know their struggles against a lot of the best teams, obviously. But either way, it's good to be able to steal some of these wins while Brunson is out, because that's what's going to allow them to stay in that 3 spot, right? As opposed to, if they lose every game while Brunson's out, then, you're probably going to drop into that 4 or 5 stretch. But, again, good bounce back couple of games for the Knicks after some bad losses.
Yeah, for sure. This was the team that I had picked to go to the finals. Not going to jump ship or anything like that. It's just not looking very likely. But overall, in the 3 games that they've had without Brunson, it is good that they're positive. Like you said, they're 2-1. Game winner was crazy, in overtime with Bridges or whatever. But yeah, like you said, that completely validates, the trade and bringing a guy like that in now and, being a win now team. I think there's definitely the right kind of logic behind that. Karl Anthony Towns, showing up once again. And, I really just want Brunson to get back, and get his feet wet before the playoffs really, kick off, because I think that if he goes in there with cold feet, then I think it's going to be really freaking bad. I could see that just blowing up instantly. So I hope he's back, in time enough, for him to get warmed up again. And, I think the team has potential to get to the Eastern Conference Finals, but that might be legit their ceiling, considering the fact that, they are just not good against teams that are quite literally obviously better than them. So that's the question of the day. But, it's good to see that they are showing, signs of life, and they're not just rolling over like some other teams that have some serious injuries.
Yeah. And then finally, I guess, last topic before we wrap up, we did get an update with LeBron, right?
Oh,
Before
speaking
we
of,
got on, yeah, before we got on to record. Sounds like that he is back in LA, right? They decided to send him back to LA along with Jackson Hayes and Rui Hachimura, right? So that's 3 starters, right? Because they've all been out due to injury. So they're day to day, so we still don't really necessarily know when he's coming back, right? But I guess, if you want to look at a positive, right? I guess you don't really want him to be on the road trip, and because again, we talked about it, they have a very tough stretch of games where they have to fly on the road, multiple back to backs, and it's tough, right? And you don't really want him, or any of the guys nursing injuries, to be on those flights, because we know that can kind of be a problem, especially if you're going to Denver, high altitude. So we'll see. I guess, does that suggest maybe he might be back sooner rather than later? Maybe. I mean, because it seems like they kind of need him, because they have not won a game since he's been out. And again, to be fair, it's not just him that's out, right? It's other guys, including multiple starters. But again, this is kind of the tough part of this late in the season, having injuries and not being able to make up for it. Because now, when we thought maybe they might get the 2 seed, now they've dropped down to 4, right? And if they can't win any of these upcoming games, they could find themselves in that 5 spot really quickly. And then you kind of have to hope and pray that you can close out the season when those guys come back and win enough games to maybe stay out of there. Because I think ideally you don't want to be in 4 or 5, because that means OKC in the second round. And I think you'd rather kind of just let them duke it out against whoever, would play them in the second round and meet them in the conference finals if you have to. But either way, just kind of interesting, right? Because it's just kind of goes to show how injuries are, right? Because we went from talking about how great this team was, right, where they had been winning every single game, right, for the last couple of months, right, and now, yeah, 3 in a row isn't bad. It's just a poorly timed 3 in a row, including a bad loss to Brooklyn. But the other part is, it doesn't seem like these guys might be back soon, right? Like, if they don't come back within the next few games and they just go like 4, 5, 6 straight games without 3 starters, you're probably going to lose all of those games, right? Like, even the game before we recorded, right? Like against the Bucks,
Oh
right?
God.
Luca
Yeah.
had 45,
Yeah.
and it didn't matter
Yeah.
because they had no size to be able to, compete or contain against the Bucks. And like that's gonna happen. It's just the toughest stretch of the season without multiple players for a team that's not very deep, right? Because some of these other teams have injuries and they're able to sustain it and be okay because they have depth and they can slide guys in. It still would be tough without three starters, but some of the teams could make up. Like we've seen Boston be able to do it, but they have a lot of depth, right? This team doesn't. And, again, I guess they can probably feel comfortable with whatever seed they are. It's not like those guys haven't been able to win, series as lower seeds. It's definitely happened before. It's just again, it's just a tough stretch because now what do those guys look like when they come back? And you're going to have to make up for it by playing even harder later on. But for them, really, now you have to recalibrate and just say, hope that you can get healthy because now you can't really push it. Because, I mean, like, there's nothing you can do about these guys being out. It's not like they're going to come back tomorrow.
Yeah, the Lakers sliding is definitely not good. And it's funny because I think when we talked about LeBron first going down, we were like, they'll be fine. But yeah, I think the culmination of everybody else going down
Right.
alongside him.
When it rains, it pours.
Yeah, that it's just horrible timing. I think I also said when Braun went down, I was like, yeah, it's Luka's time to shine. And, he's been shining. I think just obviously you can't really win a ton of games if, a lot of your starters are out. And that's the key. That's the, what's up?
Alex Len starting.
Yeah, that's just not a recipe for success considering that Jackson Hayes was already your starting center. Granted, he had been playing well. Not a slight, but I it's it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
You don't really want Alex. Yeah, you don't want Alex Len, protecting the paint when Giannis is on the court for 35 plus minutes. That's just
Poor
not.
kid.
Yeah, poor kid. It's just not a good recipe for success. And that's the roster that the Lakers built. I think that's why people had concerns initially with, well, what are we going to do this season? And I think now we're kind of getting back to maybe not true form, but a more down to earth form of what this team realistically could have looked like in the standings. But who knows? Because they were on a freaking tear, before the LeBron injury. But, it is unfortunate with the Lakers and, what they've been going through.
Yeah, because that's the thing. If it was just LeBron out,
Yeah.
but it's like most of the other guys are there,
Yeah.
you could probably be okay. Like, say you could slide Rui in. I mean, he already starts, but like, he could kind of switch to playing the four next to whomever else they put out there. But with all those guys out, they just don't have the abilities to sustain it. Like, I think against the Nets, right? Starting five was Austin, Gabe, Dalton, I think Alex Len and Luca, right? So like Luca's basically power forward, right? With with Connect and Len and Reeves and Gabe out there, and that's just kind of again. You can still say they should have beat Brooklyn for sure, but and then against the Bucks, right? It's the same lineup except instead of Dalton, it's DFS, right? Who had just come back from an ankle thing that I think he's had since he's been in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. So, and again, like the matchups too is the timing there, right? Because you're going against multiple big physical teams with just not much size, and like you said, Luka wasn't great against Brooklyn, but he was really good against the Bucks. Just a lot of turnovers, but again, what can you really do? That's kind of the issue there, where you have so many guys that are out, and it's all guys that make up the profile of that team, right? This is supposed to be, in terms of center depth, not really there, but it's a team with a lot of big, long, physical guys, right? And, some athletes too, right? But without all those guys, right? Now you're smaller, you're less athletic, you're just less physical, and you're just not as good, right? They just can't make up because they need certain types of players to be able to succeed, and that's kind of the downside of them compared to maybe some of the other teams like an OKC where we've seen them be able to, again, what would it look like if it was like four guys that start out at the same time? I mean, I think they could probably beat some bad teams because they do have a lot of depth, but LA doesn't have that. They have like a set 8 guys, right, that they're going to pretty much play consistently. And if any of their top, if any of those guys are out, it's going to be hard to replace them. Like, I think the guards, like say if, I don't know, Austin's hurt and you slide Gabe in there, you might be okay
Hmm.
because of the defense,
Hmm.
but it also is kind of dependent on can he hit some shots or not, right? But once you start talking about losing all the forwards and all the bigs, that's their identity,
Yep.
right? That's what they are. So that's where it starts to get really tough. And now we kind of have to see, can they hang on? Because like you said, we initially thought they'd be fine, but not that like it's game over if you're in the 5 spot. It's just you don't want to be there. You prefer to be, as far away from the plan as possible. And they're not going to fall into the plan, I don't think. Because there's 6 losses. They have 6 fewer losses than Minnesota, plus the tiebreaker against them. So they would have to lose literally every single game from here on out in order to get to that point. But the problem is, again, we've talked about their schedule coming up. Which games are they going to win? Because they just got blown out by the Bucks. By the time you watch this episode, they'll probably be getting ready to play the Nuggets,
Yeah.
right?
GG.
Without all their big guys, so that's probably going to be a tough game there too. Then they play the Suns. Okay, that's a winnable game, but is anybody coming back? Right? I think that's when they go back to LA. So maybe somebody will be available by that point, but we don't know. And then they play the Spurs. That's the back to back again. Again, we hadn't even talked about that, but De'Aaron Fox, his season's over, right? So
Yep.
they're already starting to tank machine, which is fine, I guess.
Yep.
Then they have a second back to back again against the Nuggets and the Bucks again, right? So if anybody can come back, if any of those 3 guys can come back, that'll help. But it just kind of shows like this time you kind of probably need LeBron. Like I said, if you had Rui and Hayes, you'd be okay. But again, every team has stretches of injuries, so that's kind of the tough part where now it's their turn, I guess. Unfortunately for them, because during the stretch where they were winning games, they were relatively healthy. Obviously, before the Luka trade, AD was out. Then Luka doesn't play the first few games, but most of their other guys were pretty consistently available, right? But now a lot of those guys are gone, and like you said, that was kind of the argument for okay, they're certainly a contender, but probably not quite, in the upper tier just because they don't have the same level of depth and they need certain guys to be available. Like, say if you lost Rui for a series, that would probably be really tough depending on the team you play against because, of how important he is to the group, right? And if you
Hmm.
don't have Jackson Hayes and you gotta, put in, Alex Len. I mean, honestly, at that point, you'd rather just put LeBron at center at that point.
Hmm.
But that's not really what you want against certain teams for an entire series. But that was the issue we talked about, which was why for them kind of stinks that the Mark Williams trade didn't work out because maybe he wouldn't have been great, or maybe and he probably wouldn't have been healthy, which is why they didn't do it. But if you had been able to pull off something, you'd have at least another option. But without that, kind of just tough luck at this point.
Yeah, man. It's really rough for for Lakers and their fans, man. Because hey, that tear was something serious, in terms of the win streak before the Boston game.
Right. And then I guess might as well close it off, right? De'Aaron Fox's season is over, right, with the finger surgery. So,
Hmm.
pretty much the Spurs season, which we already knew was done the moment Wemby had the blood clots. Now it's really done. But again, obviously you don't want guys to be done because of physical issues, right? Like with Wemby, it's the blood clots, and
Hmm.
then with Fox, it's the finger. Hopefully both of them recover fine. But if those guys are fine, then this is kind of what you want, right? Because now they're gonna be bad the rest of the way, and they'll finish with some type of lottery pick. I guess they'll get the Hawks pick too, if I'm not mistaken, right? So we'll see what comes of that, right? The Hawks might still be able to sneak into the playoffs because the East sucks, but but they'll have, 2 okay first round picks, depending on how far they fall. Probably not too far at this point because they're just better than some of the teams below them, like in terms of their record. And then you can kind of work with whatever you have in the offseason. So we didn't get to see a lot of games with Fox and Wemby together. And some of them were good, some of them were not so good. But again, it was just kind of a weird mix, right? Because it's like it was Fox and Chris Paul starting together, right? Which, again, all right, okay. But, once you go into the off season, right, then you'll probably have a roster, that can probably be closer to, all right, now we know who our main guys are, and we'll be able to go from there, right? Because, they have, a set core guys, but again, now I guess it'll be time for some of those other guys to see what they got, right? Like Let's see more of Stephon Castle. Let's see more of Devin Vassell. Let's see more of Jeremy Sohan, right? And kind of see what those guys can do. Maybe they can get some reps and some experience, for next season, right? Because those guys, Castle is the one that probably now is the most untouchable,
Hmm.
right? At this point where it may have been Vassell before, but again, things can change. But it just kind of sucks that we just didn't get to see a lot of them because we thought maybe they might challenge for a play-in spot, and then that died pretty quickly because they lost some games right at the end, and then of course they had the horrible Wemby thing.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you hate to see people go down, with medical stuff, and injuries and stuff. But I think it'll be better for the team and organization in the long run. I think it'll make building around the two guys a little bit easier, and I think it's a good thing in terms of you know getting your assets, protecting, your guys, and like you said, giving the young guys some experience because it's much needed. Like
Hmm.
as much as upside as all those guys do have, I think there's still more on the raw side where you really don't know fully what you're getting. You see the flashes, in their games, of course, especially with a guy like Castle, Vassell as well. But like, what does Keldon Johnson look like? Is he even on the team in the future? Sohan, stuff like that. So, it's a good time to really sit back, reassess, and figure out if you need to hit the reset button.
Yeah, exactly. In the 17 games he played with the Spurs, right, he gave you 20 and 7, 45 from the field, 27 from three. Again, a funky stretch for the Spurs, right? Where it just kind of a lot of weird stuff going on.
Mhm.
So not really a whole lot of takeaways from there. But I assume if he's healthy and he's ready to go, and then they put together a roster for these two guys, they'll be fine,
Yeah.
right? We'll just assuming Wemby's healthy and recovered from his blood clots and takes another leap, right? Then they should be in a good spot. But again, I'm a little bit more down on some of the young guys compared to what I was going into the season. But for now, that's okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. We do have, I suppose, a comment to read, before we head on out. So, I guess, you can fire it up and then, you'll read it, we'll react to it, and then we'll get out of here.
Yeah, it's from our short, that we did, kind of giving our soft take on who the MVP is, who we both think the MVP is going to be.
Hmm.
And the comment was from the user Lelov 1392 on YouTube, and he said BS. SGA is a good player, but he's one dimensional, while Jokic, on the other hand, is so much better than SGA across the board from rebounds, assists, 3 point percentage, and efficiency. Now, there's a lot of value in that. Stop this nonsense. Um, I think it's a good comment because I think Jokic's case is just as good as SGA's. I think SGA has, the edge in certain areas. Maybe I was a little harsh in terms of saying SGA clears Jokic. Maybe that was just the wrong, you know, choice of words, but I think I firmly do believe that because the advanced analytics, and stuff that just goes beyond numbers, the turnover ratio. There's certain things that SJ does have, above Jokic, and I think the number one thing is the record, and I know a
Hmm.
lot of people take that into consideration. You look at the team construction. Chet wasn't healthy for the majority of the year, so it was this whole season. As much of a collective um, success it's really been, I think you kind of just have to look at the top. Look at the top, and I think it starts with SGA. You can see the leadership has rubbed off on the young guys, the whole team. They look to him to pretty much do everything, on both ends of the floor. He's a two-way guy, and I think that's the beauty in it because we don't really have a lot of two-way stars in the league. Like if you look at Jokic, he does not play defense. I'm sorry, you cannot tell me that Jokic plays defense. Um, but yeah, I think they both have a great case, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, and then like you said, that's kind of the tough part with the MVP argument, where it feels like each year, like the criteria just kind of changes, right? Like a lot of times, it seems like the number one thing is the narrative, right? And I think the narrative for SGA this season is strong, right? Because with OKC, they've taken a leap this year, right? He's a big part of that, right? Like his stats, right, are really good. I guess the scoring is up, from last season. His 3 point percentage is up, so that's good. But either way, I think that's kind of the big thing is like, it's the case of back in the day at different points, right? It was kind of like the best player on the best team, which I think in the modern era is kind of tough to do now, right? But sometimes it just depends. Sometimes that is what it is over the course of the season, right? Like I think, you had the season where Harden won the MVP and they had the best record in the NBA, right? Because like the year before, Westbrook gets the triple double, he gets the MVP, he gets it again, but this time around, right? Harden, he didn't get it before, right? And then his record is better, his stats are really good, and he gets it. It just kind of depends, but I think for this season, I think like you said, because of the team success in addition to the numbers, although Jokic is, I think a lot of people can make the case the numbers are better.
Hmm.
I just think that but it's not like SGA's numbers are bad, right? Like say with Tatum, right? Like the Celtics had the best record in the NBA, but a lot of people pointed to his numbers, and it's not like his numbers were bad. It's just there were other guys who had better numbers, right? I think it was Jokic who won MVP last season, right? So, like last season, Tatum put up 27, 8, and 7. Like those are really good numbers, right? But, it just wasn't 30 and, 10 and whatever, Jokic was able to average. Well, he didn't average 30, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the big thing this year. So, like, I wouldn't have a problem if either person won it. Like our pick right now is SGA. But if Jokic won it, I wouldn't be like,
Oh,
oh, he didn't deserve it at all. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
they're both deserving of it, but I think SGA is gonna get it, and that's who I would pick right now to win it anyways. And I
Yeah.
think, I know they got smashed in the second Denver matchup, but I think what he was able to do in that first one, and I think the Boston victory. Not that that even matters, but I just think like with the way that they're closing out their seasons, I just think I think SGA is gonna win it,
Hmm.
especially just given the advantage that his team has over the field.
Yeah. 11-game lead. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's gonna stay that way. Like,
Yep.
I mean, even with the J-Dub injury, they should be fine against some of these teams
Yep.
because they've been able to win regardless.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments on, the OKC, debacle, right? The discussion of whether or not OKC and Cleveland should be classified as fraudulent teams. Your thoughts on the MVP discussion, what you think about all these other teams that have some injury issues going on right now, and maybe the thoughts on this specific Jokic SGA conversation because it feels like it's not quite there yet, but it's getting to close to toxic levels, right? Not quite as toxic as that Jokic Embiid season, but it's getting closer, right? It's
Yeah.
getting there. So, we'll see where this goes. And we'll continue to discuss all this as we get into the playoffs because it's going to be, I think a great postseason, hopefully better than last year's postseason. But let us know, right? And again, continue to comment. If you do it, we'll read it at the end of the video. Like and subscribe as well. Share the videos, right, to help our channel grow. We'll see you next time.